In the Fire Emblem games, when a character's health hits 0, this means that they are dead. They are no longer usable in the game, and there is no way of getting them back. Most players usually refer to this mechanic as Perma-Death, and whenever anybody ever discusses or talks about Fire Emblem in any way, they will inevitably bring up the Perma-Death mechanic. And they'll probably make a statement that sounds something like, "Perma-Death is a defining part of the Fire Emblem series." Which, if you think about it, is kind of an odd thing to say, because the idea of permadeath and the mechanic is in no way unique to the Fire Emblem series, and it definitely was not invented by it. There are plenty of other games that have the exact same mechanic, especially other strategy games. So, if it's not special to Fire Emblem, why do we feel like the permadeath mechanic is such a defining part of the series? Well, I think that it's because for a lot of people, their first instinct is not to compare Fire Emblem to other strategy games, but rather to compare it to other RPGs. While Fire Emblem has the structure of a strategy game, in a lot of ways it presents itself and feels more like a JRPG. And many new players getting into the series don't have much experience playing that many strategy games, but in most cases they have played a lot of RPGs. When you look at it this way, permadeath is quite unique to Fire Emblem when you compare it to traditional RPGs, where it's almost trivial to revive downed party members. In fact, that's why the mechanic is called Perma-Death, to distinguish the fact that death works differently than we are used to it working in other games. Because, in pretty much every other context other than video games, somebody dying and not coming back is just known as death. I'm sure many people had a very similar experience as I did playing a Fire Emblem game for the first time and finding out how permadeath works the hard way. You find the game in the store, you don't know what it is, and you're all like, yo, what is this? What the fuck's a Fire Emblem? Is this another RPG? Like Golden Sun? Fuck, I love Golden Sun! You get it, and you play it for a while, you reach the end of a chapter, and you say, yo, that wasn't anything like Golden Sun, but it was still pretty tight. Okay, now how do I revive my dudes? Oh, I can't? Oh no. This discovery can be quite shocking for a new player, and it definitely makes the game feel much more tense than other RPGs. And it's not just because that characters can die, but it's because that characters can die that now there is the potential for the game to go really bad. Like really, really bad. Like so bad that the game could reach an unwinnable state. It is very possible for the player to end up in a situation where they are incapable of beating the game. They could lose too many of their characters or even all of their characters, and then they just wouldn't have a strong enough army to be able to finish the rest of the game. And I think that once the player understands how permadeath works, on some level they also have to realize that this possibility exists. And that adds a lot of tension to the gameplay, and a sense of weight to all of the player's decisions. Any potential threat feels way more intimidating because they know every character lost only makes the game that much harder and gets them that much closer to a failed run. So, if permadeath makes these games super stressful and tense, you might be asking yourself, why would anyone ever want to play this? This just sounds like an awful experience all around. At which point, someone without a brain might say to you, it's about making the games more challenging so that the player feels a sense of accomplishment when they finally overcome that challenge. But that would be stupid to say because it's not really the case. Despite what I've laid out thus far, these games aren't actually that hard. Just because the games have permadeath, that doesn't automatically make them more difficult. It only adds a harsher penalty for failures. It's actually still very likely for the player to succeed and rarely, if even ever, suffer that penalty. And that's because the game gives the player an army of complete badasses that will see them through the game. The units in the player's army are usually so much stronger than the enemies that in most cases the player will have a statistical advantage. And among this army of badasses, there are some badasses that are just so badass they out-badass all the rest of the badasses and can pretty much single-handedly carry the player through the entire game. If you've ever played a Fire Emblem game, you know who these characters are. Characters that are so strong that they are borderline game-breaking. No matter what gets thrown at these guys, they'll be able to handle it. The player will naturally learn who these characters are just by simple trial and error, and eventually they will start to depend on them, almost like a security blanket. The player knows that they will always be a solid addition to their army, and whenever the player gets caught in a bad situation, it will be these characters that get them out of it. No matter how good the player thinks they are at the game, deep down they have to know that the only reason they're able to beat it is because these characters are so strong, and because of that, the player can't help but feel some connection to these characters. And this is the real amazing thing that the permadeath mechanic is able to accomplish. It creates an emotional connection between the player and their characters. It's really impressive because it's a completely organic relationship that is almost entirely facilitated through just the mechanics of the game. It's not as simple as just the player being worried about losing their characters. A lot of people have said that permadeath makes players care about their characters because if they can die just like real people, then that makes the player treat them like real people. And while this is true, I think it's only part of it. I think the real reason that the player gets attached to their characters is because permadeath and the potentials that it brings creates this scenario wherein the player feels that they and their characters are facing this challenge together, and that they are a team working with each other to get through this. They appreciate the characters for their contribution to the team and for helping them beat the game. This is why really standout characters are so memorable to players, even though they might only have like 3 lines of dialogue in total. When the DS remake of the first Fire Emblem game, Shadow Dragon, was released, a big complaint that people had of that game was that most of the characters felt kind of dull. People claimed that the characters weren't written interestingly enough, and this meant that they weren't memorable and there was no reason for the players to care about them. People probably felt this way because the game didn't have stuff like support conversations, and in general, most characters just had very little dialogue. This meant that they had almost no opportunities for characterizations to display all their wacky personality quirks. See, Shadow Dragon is the 11th game in the series. Fire Emblem, for some reason, numbers its remakes. Anyway, it came out following Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, and these games had a ton of modern touches. Path of Radiance kind of turned support conversations into the form they are now, and in both of these games the characters have a lot of characterization and they will all talk your ear off. So coming off of these games and going into Shadow Dragon, which is a very faithful remake of the original game, it's a bit understandable that people were disappointed when the game had almost none of the modern additions they were accustomed to. Especially so in the West, where the original game was never released, so people only had the more modern games to compare it to. While this criticism is technically true, I don't think it's a very good one to make, and I hope that because of what I've explained beforehand, it's already clear why I think that way. Through just how the original game and Shadow Dragon arranges their mechanics like permadeath, they're already able to make the player care a lot about their characters. So it's incorrect to say that the games give no reason for the player to care about their characters, because they do, just not through any written dialogue, but through the gameplay. Now, I'm not saying that stuff like support conversations are bad or shouldn't be in the games. I'm saying that it's wrong to say that not having them makes a game any worse. Just because a game doesn't give the player a narrative reason to care about something, that doesn't mean that it still can't accomplish it another way. I mean, you never hear people complain that their Pokemon don't talk to them or that they don't have interesting backstories. Actually, Pokemon and Fire Emblem have a lot more parallels than you might think, or rather, a specific way that people play Pokemon. I'm talking about a Nuzlocke run, a very popular type of challenge run in Pokemon. The rules of the run are fairly simple. Aside from restricting the player to only being able to catch the first Pokemon they encounter in each area, the main rule of the run is that if a Pokemon ever faints, then that Pokemon is considered dead, and they cannot be used in battle anymore. If this sounds familiar, that's because it essentially institutes permadeath in Pokemon. And it has the same effect in Pokemon that it does in Fire Emblem. The Pokemon are just a bunch of stats with a sprite, but go watch any Nuzlocke run on YouTube and you will see them get tremendously attached to their Pokemon. That's kind of the point of a Nuzlocke run. It's not just about making the game more difficult, it's more about creating emotional bonds between the player and their Pokemon. Just like in Fire Emblem, the player and their Pokemon are facing this challenge together, and that's why the player cherishes their Pokemon and will mourn their deaths almost as if they were real. And just like in Fire Emblem, there is that always looming possibility of a failed run. In fact, that's how the very first Nuzlocke ended, with a party wipe at the very last fight. Now, to wrap this whole stupid thing up, I want to make it clear that I don't want this video to be some kind of old Fire Emblem versus new Fire Emblem argument. And I'm not trying to say that the newer games suck because they added the option of casual mode, where there is no permadeath and instead downed units just revive at the end of a chapter. This might come as a surprise considering the entire premise of this video, but I actually kinda like casual mode. Only because it solves a kind of weird problem that shouldn't really exist in the first place. You see, I've been talking about permadeath in this kind of theoretical scenario, where when a unit dies, the player will continue on with the rest of the game without that character. But in practice, that's not really how it might play out. What usually happens is the player will instead just reload the last save and try again. Playing the games in this way kind of undermines the entire permadeath mechanics, and it turns a character's death from this big dramatic event into just kind of a mild annoyance. And that's why I'm kind of fine with casual mode, because it treats death how it's already being treated by some players. It's just saving them from having to waste time reloading a save. And I have to say, these games are like really long, and there's like 50 of them, so it's nice to just be able to play the game and not really care what happens once in a while. Now, it's really understandable why people would save scum. I mean, heck, even I do it a lot of times when I play the games. It comes from this desire to have this quote-unquote perfect run where you have none of your characters die. And honestly, even without save scumming, I feel like I can usually play the games well enough that I will rarely let any characters die. And there are tons of other players that can easily beat the games on the highest difficulties and still have no deaths. And most of the times, it seems like the games kind of expect the players to do this. But here's the thing, if none of your characters die, then that means that permadeath is having no effect on the gameplay. This video started with me saying that permadeath is one of the most important mechanics in Fire Emblem, but ironically, the majority of the time I play a Fire Emblem game, I almost never feel the effects of it. But I wouldn't say that disproves the entire point of this video, because everything that I've listed beforehand about why I think permadeath is a really intriguing mechanic has had almost nothing to do with the gameplay itself. It's all been much more about how it makes the player think about the game differently, and how that's what makes playing Fire Emblem a much more memorable and unique experience. And that's what I think the real contribution of permadeath is. I think that what Fire Emblem games have always really excelled at is how they are able to evoke the imagination of the player. Like, the actual action of a Fire Emblem game can be quite mundane. It's kind of just like chess, but with more numbers and menus. but because of how it uses its mechanics like Perma-Death, it's able to make moving pieces on a board and clicking options on a menu feel really intense and visceral. I mean, just by simply knowing about its existence, Perma-Death makes me think about the games in a completely different way than I would usually. The stories about the tragedies and the horrors of war suddenly become much more real to me, and it feels like there are real people fighting and dying on those digital battlefields. I even start to think that the enemies are alive themselves, and I almost feel sympathetic towards them. It even makes me have second thoughts about killing the enemy clerics, because they're completely defenseless, and there's no reason I need to kill them. What if they're just soldiers following orders? What if the only reason they're here is because they need money to buy their sick parents' medicine? I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm still going to kill them. That is free XP right there, and I am not going to pass up on it. But the fact that it made me think about all this stuff for a second is still cool, and I think it shows just how potent of a mechanic Perma-Death can be. So, I guess I would be one of those people who say that Perma-Death is a defining part of Fire Emblem, but as much as I think that, I also think that Perma-Death isn't being used as well as it could be in Fire Emblem. But like I also said at the beginning, Perma-Death is definitely not owned by Fire Emblem, and it could be in any other game, and maybe that's kind of the point of making a video in this format. Maybe by focusing in on a specific mechanic, it becomes less of a review of a game and more of an exploration of how a certain mechanic affects the game. And maybe if you wanted to make a game that had a similar mechanic that achieved a similar effect, you might get some better understanding of how it works and how you might improve upon it. But I don't know. I don't think I'm smart enough to think all that stuff through. After all, I'm not even smart enough to figure out how to make more than one video a year.